With those numbers coming in, we cross to my colleague Nompu Siziba, who's at the Results Operations Center in Pretoria. Nompu, over to you.
Thanks very much, Anastasia. Well, as the election results continue to trickle in, concerns are growing over the lower voter turnout. Many across the political spectrum have expressed concern over this phenomenon. Officials from the various political parties have converged at the IEC Results Operations Center here in Pretoria to track the results. The Chief Electoral Commissioner of the IEC, Sai Mamabolo, says 90% of the results will be finalised by this evening. All right, well, we're going to continue now. I'm joined by Angelo Fick. He's the Director of Research at Auwal Socio-economic Research Institute. Thanks very much for joining us, Angelo. Just, of course, you were observing the IEC briefing a little bit earlier. Just what were the key takeaways that came out of that briefing?
So I arrived quite late at the centre, but my sense is that they are confident that they will count every vote. They're reassuring the public that their confidence in the process is good and that these contestations will be addressed as they arise. And as you've just pointed out, they're fairly certain that within a day or two they'll have the final results.
Yeah. So what's particularly interesting now, of course, we're getting some results coming through with voting districts in excess of about 10% having come through and so on and so forth. I wanted us to have a look at Mangaung to start with.
Right.
I don't know if the colleagues have that up at the moment, but okay, they don't have it up at the moment. But okay, let's begin by talking about the voter turnout. Obviously, it was quite poor, several percentage points lower than the previous local election. What do you take away from that?
I think that it bears out the research from earlier in the year and over the last few years that demonstrated a lack of trust in the social institutions of the country, particularly in the political institutions, and in political parties' disingenuity as perceived by voters. Many voters also felt that they really had no choice, which we heard from the various journalists talking to people in the field. And I think that this is a moment in which South Africans, and not just the political parties and people who belong to them, but South Africans more generally, have to begin to think of how it is that they intend to participate in processes that will assure a future that isn't just determined by an increasingly reduced minority of the people who live in the country.
Let me bring in Sanda Ngwasheng. She's from the Cape Peninsula University of Technology. She's joining us via Zoom. Well, she's joining us from Cape Town. Thank you very much for joining us, Sanda. What is your sense of what's happening in the Cape Town Metro? Are the independent candidates beginning to make inroads, relative to the DA performance? We know that that's a DA stronghold anyway.
Hi, so just to correct you, I'm no longer with CPUT, I'm an independent political analyst.
Okay.
In terms of the independent candidates, what we're seeing is that they are starting to make inroads because, people are tired of voting for the incumbents, whether it's in the Western Cape or the rest of the country, and they are showing this by voting for more and more independent candidates and also for voting for some of the new political parties, which we haven't seen before. Because what is different between the local election and the national election is that people vote for people they know, they vote for people that they trust, and it is a lot more individualized, unlike the national elections where people rely a lot more on political parties. And I think if we've seen, all of the things that have been happening with political parties, particularly the big political parties and how they've been messing up, particularly prior to this election, I think people are showing that they're tired, that they are no longer interested in hearing false promises from politicians, especially as we're approaching 30 years of democracy, a democracy that people feel they haven't benefited from and that they haven't, reaped the rewards or seen the so-called promised land in the ways that maybe some in the middle class have seen.
Let's come back to studio now and let's have a look at Mangaung, Angelo. I think we do have that particular slide up on our screen. It should be coming up. But anyway, I will just go through it for you just to give you a sense of what's happening. So there have been 15.9% voting districts declared of the 370 that are there. And basically we are seeing that the CSIR is projecting that the ANC will get 49.8% from a current situation of 47.4%. The DA will likely decline to 24.6% from 29%, with the EFF making some decent inroads from 9.9% to 11.3%. What's your sense of what's happening here? And we know that Mangaung has been basically a failed metro under the ANC.
Right, so this is the heart of the Free State province, and it's important that the numbers that you just shared with us are comparisons for current declarations and projected. But it's also significant that if you compare them to the 2016 results, this is the first time the ANC would dip below 50% in Mangaung, because they were sitting at 56.8% then. So that's a significant shift in the province, and I think here the internal rift between the national and provincial arms of the ANC, the internal conflict in the top 6 officials. Let's not forget this is the province that used to be headed by Ace Magashule, who is the suspended Secretary General of the ANC. So this is, I think, part of the internal dynamic of the ANC playing itself out in the electoral results. But it doesn't bode well for the Democratic Alliance that they too seem to be reducing in their percentages. They were at 26.2% in the results in 2016, and they're now dipping below a quarter of the electorate. And that indicates that people are choosing smaller parties, that there is a diversification of the voting. And while many in South Africa seem to be alarmed by this, I am, I think, reading this positively, that this is finally beginning to show an end to domination by a single party of our politics, and that people at the ground level are making choices based on not only their distrust of particular politicians, which we see in the turnout, but in their ability to choose other political options and putting their votes there.
Asanda, one of the trends that we're learning about is that there has been a trend whereby people in the suburbs have been more proactive in voting relative to people in the townships. Is that something that you're hearing and observing over there?
Yes, we're observing the same, but I mean, if you think about, particularly in Cape Town, it was raining and the weather wasn't so great yesterday. And so if you're somebody who lives in a suburb and generally has a car, then you can drive and you'll be relatively safe until you get to the station. But if you're somebody that's living in a township and you don't have a car, you generally will then have to make the sacrifice of facing the elements in order to vote. And we know that the majority of Black South Africans who live in townships have not seen the fruits or the benefits of this democracy. And so it really is a no-brainer that do you choose to potentially be caught in a rainstorm, or do you just simply, allow what you think is what's going to happen, which is that the dominants are going to win yet again. And I think that's the decision that people made, because people have been voting for many, many elections and they haven't seen the difference. And so given a choice between putting yourself out there and potentially catching a flu or getting really rained on, people chose the latter. But I think also what's happening now is that I think suburban people are a lot more active and a lot more interested in politics in ways that they necessarily were not before, because some of the things that are happening are really affecting the middle class, like the rolling electricity issues and the increasing water issues are things that, the middle class took for granted, that there's always going to be electricity and that there's always going to be water. And they're getting quite a surprise with, the rolling blackouts that we've had sort of over the past 5 years at this point. And I think that's some of the thing that, has been pushing people to go out and say, actually, I'm going to vote for a political party that I think is going to potentially solve or at least prevent this lack of water and this lack of electricity, which of course for township people is a reality that they have lived with and learned to live with for almost almost 30 years.
Angelo, just picking on this discussion, now we know that constitutionally it doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor, we're all entitled to be able to vote. But it seems as though even now, elections are becoming classist in the sense that if you are fairly well off, you can go off and vote. But if you're a bit poorer, there's so many things that you need to take into consideration before you decide to even go and vote, even if you have the actual appetite to go and vote.
Yes, and I think part of the turnout problem in those working class to middle class area comparisons is the level of organization in those areas when it comes around politics. So this is an election in which we've seen political parties slightly stumble in their ability to organize and go from door to door and, do the thing that they usually do. These rallies, these abilities to get people out of the streets into spaces and talk to them. In middle class spaces, ratepayers associations play a very significant role in organizing politics. So what we've seen is ratepayers associations in the suburbs agitate the ward councillors, agitate parties, agitate the municipality for all sorts of things in a way that these professional middle class people have cultural and social capital, can use their familiarity with the law as lawyers, with accounting as accountants, and can use their professional skills to push all sorts of agendas into the city space for their wards. And councillors tend to respond to that. And so what we've seen, I think, is not just the lower turnout because of the logistical issues that Asanda talks about, but also because of the organization within those spaces by people using their critical cultural power and social power to affect the kind of turnout that they need. And I think partly in middle class spaces and suburbs, people are aware of just how significant these local government and municipal elections are. And I think that there is traditionally a sort of dismissal in the South African space, which explains the lower turnout for local compared to national elections. And I think that has to shift.
Asanda, of course, there's a huge conversation around coalitions, and as we reflect on what took place in 2016 and around the big metros, around the success or lack thereof of coalitions in the big metros, we can't run away from the fact that going forward we are going to have more coalitions, and more so because we're having more independent players coming on the scene. Do you think that coalitions can work? Is it a matter of attitude and parties putting people first rather than their political interests?
Yeah, I think that, we had some teething problems because this is the past election was the first election where we really had a big push for coalition government. Dominant parties are used to just winning outright and not having to negotiate with anybody to govern. And I think that what we saw over the past 5 years has given us some experience. Now political parties know who they can and can't, partner with. They know what some of the sticky issues are when it comes to making sure that both the political parties or all three or four, however many within the coalition, are able to deliver on their promises to their voters. And so I think there's a certain level of political maturity that I'm hoping we're going to see in this election, considering that we'll be going into 10 years of coalition government. And I'm hoping that, there's some lessons that have been learned, particularly around conflict management and how to negotiate your way when you have, some standoffs on certain issues. And for me, what's been interesting to see is how, the DA can be in coalition with somebody like the EFF, who ordinarily will seem to be on polar opposite ends, or the DA and the ANC even in some parts of the Western Cape. And I think that this is good for democracy, and this is good for all of us as South Africans, because it is really, as you said, at the end of the day, about ensuring that the will of the people is the one that takes precedence rather than our own personal agenda and our own political party agendas.
All right, now let's take a look, Angelo, at Nelson Mandela Bay. We are now seeing data coming from the CSIR. 13.2% of the voting districts have been declared. And we do see that the ANC had a success of 41.5% in 2016, the DA 46.7%. The projection by the CSIR is that the ANC will come out at around 38.5%. Of course, it's still early days because it's only a declaration of 13%. And the DA at 44.2%. Both parties basically losing ground. We know that that particular metro has been besieged with problems, in terms of the coalitions there and the infighting and all the rest of that. What's your reading there, and also your reading of how, the smaller parties are doing in that particular metro?
So my sense is that the reduction of the support for the two bigger parties is not that significant. But so the reductions are from the mid-40s to the slightly lower 40s, to use such terms. But what's also crucial is that in the smaller party constructions, you have all sorts of new coalition possibilities arising. And these new players in the Nelson Mandela Bay Metro, I think, will make some kind of shift in the politics that have sort of mired that municipality in trouble for the last 5 years.
Asanda, of course, we know that there's a big debate about whether our election system actually works, given the fact that so many people chose to stay back at home or at least enjoy a long weekend. Is there a problem with the system, or not necessarily, and it's more about our politicians? And what needs to happen for us to have a more inclusive election system such that everybody partakes and actually benefits from this democracy?
I think that it's both, that there is a problem with the political system, that it prioritizes political parties, and when political parties fail and are unable to hold the people who represent them accountable and are unable to remove them at the times that communities are requesting that they be removed, then it really leads to a lot of frustration, because there's nothing more upsetting than putting your vote towards somebody who belongs to a particular party and then going to them and saying, you're not doing what you said you're going to do, you haven't delivered on any of your promises, and they're ignoring you, and then going to their political party head office and trying to make the same case and being ignored, and sometimes even being told that actually this is our best candidate or our best councillor that you are criticizing, and we don't actually, quite frankly, believe you. And this is the thing that frustrates people, that it doesn't matter how happy or unhappy I am, the political party is going to continue to place this person even after we've given them a literal vote of no confidence, through protests, through even sometimes in communities burning down the councillor's home and literally hounding the councillor out of the community, and political parties still will field the same candidate. I think where there is some hope is in part in the PR system, where some of the smaller parties get the opportunity to be able to get a seat even though they don't necessarily have a ward councillor, so that there's a greater representation of different voices. And I think what we've been seeing with the independent candidates and the allowing of independent candidates, not only in local government but also in national government, is really going to help us, because it means that people who are popular, people who have their community's interest at heart, and people who have done the work, the hard work of actually delivering for their communities, are going to be given the opportunity to fight it out. And I think local government elections are less, in some ways, still obviously party loyalty, but not as much party loyalty as we see in the national elections. And so between, the fact that you've got the PR system, which allows some small parties, and the fact that you now have independent candidates able to duke it out with the big political parties, there is a little bit of improvement, but it's going to take time before people start to believe that this improvement is going to be to their benefit and not just another ploy for politicians to continue to figure out new ways of literally being corrupt and eating the money that we give them with our hard-earned tax.
Asanda and Angelo, thank you very much for your contributions for now. Hopefully we do still have time to continue exploring the election. Let me cross now to my colleague Diabo Sito, who's on the floor for us. Diabo.